we see happening here in the last few verses of chapter 25, in verses 23 down through verse 27, basically what we see unfolding here is we're going to see the stage kind of set by Festus in order for King Agrippa to have the opportunity to hear Paul for himself. Now, Agrippa is a king, so again, Jesus' commission was that Paul was going to have the opportunity to speak to kings. So here is an opportunity to preach to a king. So his preaching tour is continuing right on. And he's all during this time, he's being protected by the Romans from the Jews, and to them, he is having the opportunity to share the gospel. So notice what happens. It says the next day, Agrippa and his wife Bernice, they came with great pomp and entered the audience room with high-ranking officials and the leading men of the city. So Festus has set up the opportunity for King Agrippa to hear Paul tell his side of the story. What's going on? And later on down in here, what we'll find out is Festus set this up because Festus has a dilemma. Festus is responsible for Paul. Now, he was a prisoner left over by Felix. Felix should have handled the matter. Felix should have set Paul free because he's done nothing, either against Roman law or against Jewish law. He hasn't done anything. But the Jews are so upset with him, and they're trying to take his life. They're trying to get the Romans to do something whereby they can get a hold of him and end his life. So Festus has a problem on his hands. This is the thing we were talking about with Tertullus. Not with Tertullus, but Lysistrus, the Roman commander. He's trying to get Paul out of his hands. He's responsible for him as the Roman centurion in Jerusalem. Everything that goes on, he's responsible for the peace. He's trying to do what he can to get Paul cleared so that peace could return to the city. And so now Festus is doing the same thing. He's trying to get rid of Paul basically himself. Paul has already appealed to Caesar. We know that. We read that back in an earlier chapter. So he's going to. And Festus has decided to send Paul to Caesar. But he really doesn't have a charge. And it would not have been very wise for Festus coming on the scene as the new procurator or his administration being responsible for Caesarea, Jerusalem, responsible for that area that's under his authority. It would not have been wise on his part. It would not have been a good political move to send Paul to Rome to stand or make an appeal before Caesar, and Caesar not even know what the charge is. I could imagine that would be like political suicide to do something like that. So he asked his brother-in-law, Agrippa's his brother-in-law because of who she's married to. So he asked his brother-in-law, what can I do? What can I say? And we see that in verse 26. He says, I have nothing definite to write to His Majesty about this guy. He'd like to ship him off, but he doesn't have any charges, any formal charges, and Paul happens to be a Roman citizen. So he has a right to be heard he has a right to appeal to Caesar, and Festus has agreed to send him, but he doesn't really have a charge. So they have this thing set up, and it's with great pomp and circumstance, I guess we could say there. The ranking officials, all the leading men of the city, they gather at the command of Festus. You can imagine in your mind, just try to imagine in your mind this big setting where all the high officials are together. Paul's brought in, and Festus says, King Agrippa, it's all very official, it's all very formal. King Agrippa and all who are present with us, you see this man, the man that everyone wants to get rid of. The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that this man ought not to live. That he is, he must be a very notorious bandit of some type because he is worthy of death according to the Jews. But in verse 25, Festus, who could have ended the whole ordeal had he just made this declaration to the Jews, but we learned that he was always wanting to extend a carrot to the Jews. He wanted to do the Jews a favor in an effort to help keep peace in Jerusalem. What's interesting is when you read some historians about Roman law and things like that, and about what was going on in this period of time. The Jews in Jerusalem, although they were under occupation of Rome, they had influence in Rome. They could send complaints to Rome, and I'm sure the last thing that Caesar and his administrators, those working below him, the last thing they want to know is there's problems in Jerusalem. And so Caesar would send someone to take care of it. So this is why Festus would not want any rumblings of conflict or discourse or confusion, chaos or confusion going on in Jerusalem. And he says in verse 25, Festus said, I have found nothing deserving of death, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I've decided to send him to Rome. So he wants Agrippa to help him with writing some type of formal charge to send with Paul as he is taken to Rome. Therefore, verse 26, the second part, therefore I brought him before you, and especially you, King Agrippa, so that the result of this investigation I may have something to write. For I think it is unreasonable to send the prisoner without specifying the charges against him. So that's what we see happening in the end of chapter 25. The scene is set, the stage set, so to speak, where Paul has the opportunity to preach once again. Now think about this. Every time Paul gets an opportunity, whether it's in a synagogue, whether it's by a creek bank, we read about that in one of the earlier chapters when he just found some ladies seeking to worship on Saturday morning. Whether it's there, whether it's in a synagogue, whether it's at the Areopagus, whether it's in a market, wherever Paul is, what is he always ready to do? He's always ready to preach. He's always ready to share the gospel. And so it doesn't matter if it's men, as he'll say here later, great or small, doesn't matter. He's always ready to share the gospel. So what should that say to us? We should be ready to share our hope, our faith, whenever the opportunity avails itself. Whether it's in a positive situation or perhaps a negative situation. He's been under house arrest for quite some time now. But everywhere he shows up and is given the opportunity to speak, he is willing to do that. You remember I shared with y'all a few weeks ago, I think it was on Wednesday night, about Jerry Falwell. You mentioned that name, half the crowd loves him, half the crowd hates him. I mean, Jerry Falwell was a type of a guy who, people had strong opinions about. Jerry Falwell professed to be a born-again believer. And his testimony bears that out. And they always ask him why he would go on any television program at any time. Why would you always do this? Some of these programs you go on, people were challenging him why he would go on Larry King all the time. And his reason for going on that was just think about it. I go on to these shows who have oftentimes either a national platform or some a worldwide platform, and I get to preach the gospel for free. And he said, I'll never go on a show and engage in an interview where I'm not going to present the gospel. And if you think back, he always does that. And he said, there's no way I could have ever raised enough money to have bought that time. But people just invited me, and if you invite me to come, you need to know I'm going to preach the gospel. And so, where did he learn that from? He learned that from the Apostle Paul. Wherever he was at, he took the opportunity to preach the gospel. Chapter 26. Then Agrippa said to Paul, you have permission to speak. So what we see here is, Paul is going to, like Tertullus, back before Felix, who kind of, in his opening statement to the presiding official, he was kind of over the top and filled with flattery. Paul Paul here is going to be very respectful to Agrippa because he knows that he has a great opportunity. Maybe not to win his freedom. He's not going to win his freedom. Why is he not going to win his freedom? Because he's already appealed to Caesar. He's going to Rome. But he has a great opportunity to fulfill part of God's call on his life, and that's to preach to high-ranking officials, Gentiles and Romans. So Agrippa says you can speak. Paul motions with his hand, I'm sure in deference, recognizing him. In verse 2 of 26, it says, King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate to stand before you and make my defense against all the accusations of the Jews. In verse 3, especially, he feels fortunate, especially because you are very well acquainted with Jewish customs and controversies. The charges against Paul was a Jewish, religious, traditional controversy. That was the problem. That was why they wanted to get rid of him. But they didn't feel as though they could take his life legally. They saw a couple of different plots to take his life illegally. But they got him charged now. And he says, I'm fortunate, Paul says, I'm fortunate to be before you because you're familiar with the ways of Judaism. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. So his plea is just hear me out. And this is where we begin with Paul's opportunity to preach the gospel, basically to speak to high-ranking officials. In verses 4 through 8, Paul informs Agrippa of his upbringing. He informs him of his education. He informs him of his way of life. He informs him about some of the things that he believes. The Jews all know the way that I've lived ever since I was a child, from the beginning of my life, in my own country, and also in Jerusalem. So they were aware of who Paul was. They knew his history. And he shared this with Agrippa. Verse 5, they have known me for a long time and can testify, if they are willing to, that according to the strictest sect of our religion, that he had lived as a Pharisee. In verse 6, and now it is because of my hope in what God has promised our fathers that I'm on trial today. In verse 7 talks about that promise. He says the promise to our 12 tribes, what they're hoping for, they're hoping to see the fulfillment as they earnestly serve God day and night. O King, it is because of this hope that the Jews are accusing me. Well, the hope of the 12 tribes would be that the nation of Israel that was scattered as a result of their disobedience to God in the Old Testament, they were cast out of the promised land. The hope of Israel was that God would resurrect or restore the nation of Israel. And they have been praying for that day in and day out, year after year. They've been praying for that. The Pharisees had, Sadducees had, all the religious leaders, they've been praying for that. And when the servant of the Lord comes, the one who is going to be the key individual to make this happen, they don't recognize him. Mainly because the Sanhedrin was led by Sadducees, and the Sadducees, as we have learned earlier in their study, they reject the resurrection. How could Jesus be the Messiah if he was killed on the cross? He can't be, because God is not going to allow his son to die, because his son is going to sit how long on the throne? Forever. So this guy from Nazareth, Jesus the Nazarene, according to the religious leaders, he cannot be, from their perspective, he cannot be the Messiah. But Paul has come to recognize him. Now, Paul once rejected him as well, right? And that's what was leading. That's where he met the Lord, and he's going to talk about that here in a minute. So he gets right to the heart of the conflict here in verse 8. Why should any of you consider it incredible that God raises the dead? Paul had already said, I'm on trial because of my belief in the resurrection. And here it is what he's talking about. Why should it be incredible that God would raise the dead? God can do what? He can do anything. And they know he can do anything. but they have rejected the Messiah, the anointed one, the servant of the Lord. So in verse 9, what do we see here in verses 9 through 15? What we see is Paul begins to talk about his pre-conversion testimony. So he said, I too was convinced. What was he convinced of? He was convinced that Jesus of Nazareth was not the Messiah. He was so convinced that I ought to do all that was possible to oppose the name of Christ. In verse 10, and that is just what I did in Jerusalem. And he did it on the authority of the chief priests. Those who are seeking to kill his life now, or take his life, are probably some or descendants of some who were working through Paul back a few years earlier. He said, on their authority, I put many saints in prison, and when they were put to death, I cast my vote. Or in other words, he was in agreement to them being put to death. Verse 11, many a time I went from one synagogue to another to force them to blaspheme, to force true believers to deny and reject the name of Christ. He said, in my obsession against them, I even went to foreign cities to persecute them. And this is where we are on the road to Damascus. This is Acts chapter 9. On one of these journeys, and he's still having the opportunity to speak to Agrippa. So we could say, Agrippa, on one of these journeys, I was going to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priest. And about noon, O king, as I was on the road, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, blazing around me and my companions. We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Is it hard for you to kick against the goads? Then I asked, who are you, Lord? So we've studied that back in Acts chapter 9. But Paul is recalling for Agrippa, hey, that at one time I was among this group that's seeking to take my life. We had pretty much the same understanding as to Jesus not being the one that we're looking for. But after he met the Lord on the road to Damascus, things began to change. So what we see in verses 16 through 23, we're reminded of the call of Paul, the commission that Christ placed on his life. So Paul is still sharing his testimony. Basically in 4 through 8, he talked about who he was. In 9 through 15, he talked about where he was, or what he was doing. And what we're going to see happen here, he's going to be talking about what he's supposed to be doing now, since he has met the Lord. He says, in the second half, or in verse 16, he says, or second half of verse 15, he says, I am Jesus. In response to Saul's question, or Paul's question, who are you? Whom you are persecuting, the Lord replied. Now get up and stand on your feet. Did you notice there's not much negotiation in this call? It's almost like a prophetic call to maybe Ezekiel. Hey, get up. I've got a plan and a purpose for you. And he says, I have appeared to you. For what purpose has he appeared to him in verse 16? To appoint him, to commission you, to do two things. Notice in verse 16 what he's to do. First of all, you're to be my servant. So Paul is being called to serve the Lord. Well, we're called to be servants, right? All of us are called to serve the Lord. And Paul was also called to do a second thing. And notice what it is. He's to be a witness. And that's the same call that you and I enjoy as well. That we are, as a part of the Great Commission, we have been called to serve the Lord and to testify, to proclaim, to witness, to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. So he says here, I'm going to appoint you as a servant and as a witness of what you have seen of me and what I will show you. Verse 17, I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. He's already done that. He's the one who has rescued Paul on a couple of occasions before he ever gets to Jerusalem. And now that he's in Jerusalem, he's being rescued from the Jews who are seeking to take his life, and also from any Gentiles. He said, I am sending you to them to open their eyes and to turn them from darkness to light. Preaching the gospel, seeking what? Seeking repentance. A message of repentance. And from the power of Satan, turn them from the power of Satan under the bondage of sin to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins, and not only receive forgiveness of sins, but they may find a place among the saints. Isn't that what he's saying there at the end of verse 18? So that they will receive forgiveness of sin, and as a result of the forgiveness of sin, they will have a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me, those who are set apart to be a part of the kingdom of God. The resurrection of Israel, to be a part of what God is doing. In verse 19, so then Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the vision. And we know that by reading and studying through these chapters. He's been very active. He hasn't been disobedient. He's been very active in the commission. Everywhere he's been, he first would go to the Jews or to the synagogue if the place he went was big enough. He would go to the synagogue, and then after that he would go to the Gentiles. So he said, I've not been disobedient. In other words, I've been obedient to the vision from heaven. First going to Damascus, and then in Jerusalem, and then in Judea, and to the Gentiles also. I have preached that they should repent and turn to God. Not only turn to God, but give demonstration, the same as John the Baptist was preaching in the Gospels, that there would be evidence, is what he's saying, that there would be evidence by their deeds, by their changed lives. So this is what he's been preaching. And he says, that's why the Jews seized me in the temple courts and tried to kill me. But I've always had God's help to this very day. And so I stand here and testify to both small and great, which would include what? Probably from the lowest socio-economic level servant in there, all the way to the king. To both small and great, I stand here before you. I am saying nothing beyond what the prophets and Moses said would happen. That Christ would suffer, and as the first to rise from the dead would proclaim light to his own people and to the Gentiles. And that's right out of Isaiah chapter 42 and following. That a light has come. And that light was not only coming to Israel, that light was also coming to the Gentiles as well. And Paul is saying Christ is it. He is the one. It's Jesus. That's why I'm on trial. They've rejected him. I've come to receive him. In verse 24, at this point, notice in verse 24, not everyone is willing to accept the gospel. And some folks can only listen to so much, and this is where Festus is at. Festus was looking for something that he could write to Caesar as a charge, and what he's getting presented to him is the gospel. So he interrupts Paul's defense, and he says, you're out of your mind, Paul. Your great learning is driving you insane. But Paul responds in a very prominent way. You remember one time he responded pretty wrong when he was in the Sanhedrin, and they challenged him a little bit, and he responded to the chief priest in a very negative way, and he got slapped in the mouth. This time, Paul responds very respectfully, and he says, I'm not insane. Notice what he says, most excellent Festus. Paul replied in verse 25, what I am saying is true and reasonable. The king is familiar with all these things, and I can speak freely to him, because primarily this is who he's wanting to speak to, the king. I am convinced that none of this has escaped his notice, because Agrippa was very familiar with the Jewish customs and controversies. He was very familiar with Judaism. He said, I'm pretty sure that nothing has escaped him. Because it was done not in a corner as if out of sight. King Agrippa, notice what he does here. He asks for a decision. You know, he's presenting the gospel. Now he's asking for a decision. He's asking the king if he'd like to become a believer. That has to be, that's pretty bold. That's bold. And so there should be an example here. You know, as if we look to others, Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ. And there are lots of other great evangelists and just great believers down through the years who are willing to speak boldly. But for him to ask the king, hey, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. Asking him to make a decision. In 29, look at 29. Or 28. So Agrippa responds to Paul. Agrippa says to Paul, do you think in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian? So I imagine that Agrippa's in pretty much a little hot. He's in between the proverbial rock and the hard place here. He's a Gentile. He's working in the Roman governmental system. He's married to a Jew, but he's happily, and this guy's asking him if he wants to be a Christian, which would be putting him on the spot, which would certainly not be something that Agrippa would want to respond to right away. Would have great implications. No doubt it had great implications. It would change his life radically. Look at verse 30. The king rose, and with him the governor of Bernice, and those sitting around him. When the king gets up, everyone, I suspect, gets up because they left the room, and while they were talking with one another, they said, this man has not done anything to deserve death or imprisonment. And that's true. He really hasn't done anything. All he's done was seek to minister to people, strengthen and encourage them in their faith, and lead them to faith in Christ so that they can live in eternity in fellowship with God. And Agrippa says to Festus, he could have been free if he hadn't appealed to Caesar. And he probably could have been free. But God has been watching over his chosen instrument, Paul. The Jews had sought what did the Jews sought to do? What were they trying to do? They were trying to thwart God's plan. And I think there's a parallel to this somewhat in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. You remember the story of Joseph and his brothers? And God had chosen Joseph as one that he was going to work through. And as Joseph continued, he didn't go about it the best possible way with his brothers, sharing with them, telling them, he being the youngest, that his oldest brothers were going to be bowing down to him. That's probably not the way to open the conversation. Hey, I've had this dream. One of these days you guys are going to be serving me. And, that's not how Dale Carnegie would have taught him to win and influence friends. But that's what he did. And later on, at the end, after Joseph goes through some very difficult and trying times, with Potiphar's wife, and then some other things that go on, they go through a famine. He's raised to a high position. And when Jacob dies, the brothers think that this is the opportunity for Joseph to finally get rid of us. We're dead now. And Joseph tells them what? Tells the brothers what? What you meant for evil, God meant for good. What the Jews had meant for evil, they're trying to remove God's chosen instrument. God is working for the good. The Apostle Paul is sharing the gospel. We have no way of knowing who was in that audience that day. We have no way of knowing if someone in that audience that day didn't receive Christ. We don't know that. But what is Paul doing? Paul's just fulfilling the commission. He's sharing the gospel when he gets the opportunity. And I think the picture there for us is being faithful to the commission that we've been called to, Matthew 28. Being faithful to the commission. And when we have the opportunity, share. And share the gospel. And one of the ways that you go about sharing the gospel is, first of all, talking about who you were, which Paul did. Talked about, you could perhaps share a little bit of your testimony about what your life was like. You met the Lord, and what's He called you to do now. And this is why I'm sharing this with you, because this is what the Lord has called me to do. So I think there's some parallels there for us. But still, the main thing here is, God had already told Paul back, where did we, I think it was in 23:11. The Lord stood by Paul and said, hey, take courage. It may look difficult. Times are tough. Take courage. The way that you testified about me in Jerusalem is the same way you're going to testify about me in Rome. And when we get to chapter 28, we end the book with this statement about Paul. He's in Rome, chapter 28, verse 14. And so we came to Rome, Luke says. And then in verse 31, what it said, the last word that we hear about Paul is that he is boldly and without hindrance. He preached the kingdom of God and taught them about the Lord Jesus Christ. That's the example set for us. Whatever happens, others may mean it for evil, but God has called us to do good, and that good is to share the gospel of Christ. Amen? Amen. Amen. Hey, any thoughts, questions? Rapidly moving through the book of Acts. So just thinking about looking back to those who have come before us and learning from their example, their witness, their testimony, their lives should be a great encouragement to all of us.